Hi there, this is part of a series we're doing on vendor management offices and building a supplier management function, and specifically around core processes. We've given reasons in the past on other videos around why you should consider building your core processes and defining what they are, but these are going through a number of processes that we think are core that you might find interesting. This one is about obligation management.
Vendor Ops, powered by Brooklyn Solutions.
So what is obligation management at a scope level? So effectively it's the ability to extract and create successfully curated obligations, so things that the suppliers or the buyer are obligated to do out of the contract. Contracts are a multiple-page document, quite bland in nature, very lot of legalese. It's about taking out the relevant information that says the vendor will, the supplier will, or any other third party will, and managing that accordingly. So if we break that down into its salient parts, well, what is it? So, like I said, first definition is a supplier responsibility. So contractual document is an agreement, it's a vehicle for something that's about to take place over a determined amount of time. There'll be responsibilities on the supplier to deliver that to the buyer. So first point to focus on is what are those responsibilities? When do they need to take place? What needs to be done? What's considered a successful delivery? What stage gates are there? Is it timing based or is it data driven at a certain situation? And then document how those things need to be carried out. A lot of the contracts essentially will say what needs to be done. They won't necessarily say the how and the process to go around it. So what really should happen is where, especially in the supplier sense, if you are the supplier and you're extracting your responsibilities, you need to then pair that with an internal process that says ideally how you do that thing that you're contractually committed to do. And in the buyer sense, if you look at the supplier's responsibilities, it's not unfair for you to sort of quiz the supplier on how they're going to go about that and get a report on the structure of how they're approaching that responsibility or that obligation. Equally, on the other side of the fence, to make a contract successful, there is commonly things the buying organisation needs to do to make sure the supplier can be successful, like access to information, access to people, access to data, and the like. Very similar to the supplier's responsibilities, the buyer, when they extract the buyer responsibilities, has to pair that with somewhere in the organisation, the people that carry that out, the people with the right information, tool set, clarity of process that are going to deliver the things that buyer responsibility is asking for. And finally, third-party responsibilities. On some contracts, it's listed as neither the supplier or the buyer, although it will be either one of those organisations that are likely to be managing this third party. There is third-party responsibilities, which is typically where a supplier is supplying a set of services to a buying organisation, but one of those or part of one of those services is not actually supplied by the supplier, it's supplied by a third party that sits behind the supplier. So it is still technically a supplier responsibility, but sometimes you see the third party responsibility sat in a contract, and if you're from the supplying organisation, you may want to distinguish between what you're doing internally, so what is truly the supplier's responsibility, and what you're doing with one of your third parties. And that's still the supplier's responsibility, but you might manage it in a slightly different way because it is a third party and you might have to go to your contract that then provides the service that you're making up as part of the service you're providing and make sure that scope is relevant and fits with the nature of what you're being contracted to do. Key point here, I've touched upon it a couple of times already. When you take these statements and these obligations out from a contract, it will give you no information typically around how you're going to operationalise that clause. It is legalese and it is very brief. It doesn't commonly cover the who. So it will cover the who in terms of an organisational level, supplier, buyer, third party, like I said, but it doesn't cover the actual who's going to carry it out like in a racy sense, so responsible, accountable, consulted and informed. You really need to add to it that level of detail because an organisation doesn't do anything. An organisation is an entity that is a collection of people. You need to get it down to the people and teams level. So who, when do they need to do it? What's the guidance on how they carry that out? Are there templates available on that specific thing that they're going to do to make sure they do it in the same uniform, right level of quality, right level of control? You might want to look at previous videos we've done on building process and policies because essentially that clause you're extracting, underpinning that is a policy and process that lists all these things about guidance, templates, checklists, examples of what good looks like. And that means it will get delivered in the manner it was intended in the spirit of the contract if you're very clear on what that is. But the contract will not hold that data. Again, as I already said, you'll have to take the clause out and mint it with some kind of process about delivering that thing the clause is talking about. You have to establish reporting, so if it's a long, protracted obligation, if it's not a very simple one that's basically in and done, you're probably going to have to establish a reporting cadence to assure either supplier or buyer that this clause is being delivered in the spirit of the contract over an extended period of time. So is it on or off target? Also reminders of when it needs to be done, when the next gate is due. Some of them are staged obligations, etc. And some of these contracts, remember, will extend over 2, 3, 5, 10 years. So they need to be written there because the people in that organisation may change and the responsibilities may change. So it needs to be clear on the reporting of what level of progress has been made against that obligation. Key terms need to come out, as we've mentioned this before. So the key terms, as I've kind of already touched upon, delivery stages. What are the stages of that obligation? If it's a schedule, what are the payment schedules or the payment breaks of when a supplier can ask for a payment or minimum commits, etc. They all need to be extracted out and known as part of these obligations and when delivering. And also, kind of similar, but sometimes put in a different category, is metrics, SLAs and OLAs. Some contracts commit around certain metrics, SLAs and OLAs, and they can be managed as SLAs and OLAs separately, but they're still just a contractual obligation. They've still got the spirit of the same thing that an organisation will deliver or receive something to an agreed minimum bar of quality. So that needs to be extracted and managed too as well. You might do it in a slightly different way because it is an SLA as opposed to an obligation, but in the spirit it's the same thing. Rights come out here. So again, there's another thing, not truly in the spirit of total contractual obligation, but they're key terms in the contract that you're going to want to extract out and be quite aware of. So when you're delivering the services or the services are being delivered to you, you know your rights around termination, cancelling certain parts of the project, so not full termination, but downsizing, etc. Changing it, like I said, size, shape, volume. Can you expand it? Can you contract it? Minimum commits. Are you got in refunds or service credits based on performance? And also break points in the contract. 5-year contract, you might have a break point after the first year or year 4. That needs to all come out of the contract and be centrally held for you to refer to in the future for both sides and both organisations. Evidence and audit, so contractual obligations come out. They're used as part of, especially in a regulated industry, evidence as to how the contract's being managed. And that evidence, we said, if it's documented in the right way, will build up over time and then you'll be able to be audited. So storing the data in terms of what the contract was being asked to do at a detailed level from an obligation perspective, and then twinning that again with the processes that I said, so you've got proof of action and completion against that obligation, so it can be easily seen that you was delivering in the spirit of the contract, especially, like I said, if it's a regulated industry and there's regulation around that specific supplier or specific thing being supplied. Another good reason for bringing out your obligations is deviation escalation. So if you're not managing the obligation effectively, you're not really going to be able to spot when it deviates. And then if you can't spot when it deviates, you can't escalate and course correct. So you're going to end up with commonly a lot worse of failure scenario if you're not managing the obligation. It's going to be, chances are, a surprise, late in the day, something happens, you're not getting the benefits you see from the contract. And commonly you'll track that back to, well, the obligations haven't been well managed, they haven't been well reported on. So we're, like I said, at the 11th hour and we've worked out it's all gone wrong and everyone's going to be not happy and not in a good place. So by managing an obligation in the lines with what we've just mentioned before this, you're going to be able to spot deviation, and thus if you can spot deviation, there's a good chance you can escalate and fix it before it becomes a problem. So course correcting early. And for all of this isn't really part of the process, but you're going to need digital platform capability and support in some shape or form. The reason we say this is because, I'll give you an example, a few contracts that I've worked on in my career. So I've worked on a 5-year contract that had over 1,200 individual obligations on just the buying organisation over that period of time. And that's broke down over an IT organisation that was over 1,000 people. So there's no way without some central coordination, looking at dates, some of the complex scopes and the multiple deliverables, and again, the large volumes, that you're going to be able to cover it with pen and paper or Word documents in Excel. You're going to need something a bit more advanced than that to bring it back together centrally and know whether you're on target or not. Recently, we've seen contracts that were 500 pages long and then over 2,500 obligations in. And that was a 10-year deal. There's just no way, again, that you're going to be able to get the coverage, the controls in place and the clarity around what needs to be done and when through email, right? It's just not going to happen. So there needs to be digital support there. That was contractual obligation. I realise we mentioned it in the onboarding process because the onboarding process is made up of a lot of little sub-processes, but that was a specific one on extracting and managing obligations. I hope that was useful. There are going to be 11 of these. If you think we've missed one or are missing points to one that are very key, put it in the comments, provide your feedback. Thank you.
Vendor Ops, powered by Brooklyn Solutions. To keep up with the latest vendor ops news, subscribe here and follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. Links in the description below.